Okay, welcome everyone. I just wanted to welcome everybody to this RDA virtual session, and thanks very much to RDA for, continuing the conference. It's been fantastic to be able to do that in a virtual, even though it makes it a little bit more difficult. But yeah, I think we're all learning to adapt in the current situations. Before I start, I wanted to also acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that we're all meeting on here in Australia, and also internationally, and pay my respects to elders past, present and future, and also acknowledge the First Nations people internationally, and those Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that are here today. I pay my respects to them. This session is going to be a follow-on actually from, I don't know if many people had the opportunity to listen to the other Indigenous Data Sovereignty or Fair and Care Principles session this morning at 6 o'clock. Maui was there already, and I see Stephanie's on this session as well. That was a fantastic meeting, and I'd recommend people having a listen to that as well. Just as a oops, I'm going to try and make my thing go as well. Just a few, before we start, just a few logistics. Where you're on, we'll be recording this session and making it available for others who couldn't be able to dial in, particularly internationally as it's in the middle of the night. Again, just a few sort of logistics around keeping on mute while we're doing the presentations as well, and I'll unmute other people after that. There is a bit of a hand function, and I don't know whether we'll see the hand function if you want to raise your hand or just sort of wave in the video if you've got your video on as well. I thought what we might do is, if you have questions as you go along or trying to remember things, add them into the chat function, and we'll keep a we'll keep doing that way. So in the chat function, try and do that. And again, there is a Google link to add your name and registration details if you'd like, as well as your interest in this particular session as well. If you have any technical questions, put them up in the chat function, because Stephanie with an F is here. We've actually 3 Stephanies on this meeting. I really see 3 Stephanies at the same time. So and she'll be able to help you with any of those technical questions. Just for today, I'm going to give a bit of a quick overview, some context and some potential way of framing later discussion. Mao is going to give a longer discussion around an overview of the TK labels and biocultural labels, including some background on sort of Indigenous data sovereignty principles as well. John, I hope John is online as well. I think I saw him. I'm not quite sure if I've given him a text. John, are you there? Hopefully. I will try and text him in the meantime, so hopefully he's still there. And then we also have Dan Robinson and Margaret Raven from MNSW, who are going to give us a bit of background on their work. So I'll move straight into the discussion, just to give a bit of a high-level context around some of the things that we're talking about today. At an international perspective, we've got a number of different conventions, whether it's the Nagoya Protocol and the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, that looks at how we manage genetic resources, but also references traditional knowledge and issues around informed consent and, mutually agreed terms. We've also got, looking at it from a sectoral-based perspective, we've got intellectual property regimes, whether it's through WIPO, who's been trying for many years to look at different protection mechanisms for Indigenous cultural intellectual property, as well as the work that IP Australia has been recently doing, looking at the IP system in Australia and how we might protect Indigenous knowledges. In Australia and internationally, there's a lot of ethical frameworks, which can also drop from, the UNDRIP as well. To here in Australia, we've also not only we've got different ethical guidelines for Indigenous peoples, but we've got a broader code for responsible conduct of research. But where we wanted to sort of focus today is that sort of movement around Indigenous data sovereignty, and Mao is Stephanie and others, some of the sort of key founders and people who are really promoting some of the initiatives and ideas in this space. but across that digital and data space, there's sort of a lot of issues around open data, publicly funded data, ethical, guidelines around data, those types of initiatives that I think really need to be informed by some of the things that we're going to be talking about today. But a lot of these create obligations, whether they're legal or even the necessity to try and have best practice. For instance, in Australia, we haven't yet, I think, ratified the Nagoya Protocol, but, if we as, a community want to be operating internationally with those other organisations that have, or states that have, we need to be looking at doing things at best practice at an international level. So just as a segue into that, there are different ways that, and these is, I'm trying to sort of provide just some different framing. One of these is looking at ways that we can protect Indigenous data or Indigenous cultural intellectual property. And there are, you can come at it at many ways. We have potentially our IP laws through copyright, patents, trademarks and other mechanisms that you can do, can have that protection. But in other circumstances, it doesn't really operate, and we may need to either, operate at a contractual level in the way that we do business with others, and we can embed the recognition of cultural intellectual property and the protection of whatever type of IP or data through those types of terms as well. And there's a really important component around protocols, and I've got a sort of, a relatively wide definition of what those protocols might look like. They can be in our ethical practice as a way that we undertake things, can be in our guidelines and procedures that we as organisations commit to. It's actually, Indigenous organisations and may also have their own protocols they expect partners to work with as well. But there's also another concept too, is how do we actually look at sort of respecting also Indigenous knowledges in a digital context as well. And just to give you a quick, example of where we potentially, this big ecosystem makes systemic change is actually also in the way that we represent knowledge. Just using as an example the Atlas of Living Australia, which is a national biodiversity portal here in Australia. It's now starting to include language names in what would always be as a system, represented through scientific names. It is structured around a linear taxonomic system, but, a lot of Indigenous peoples may look at knowledge in a different way, and how can we represent knowledges in different ways and change those perspectives in systems. And as a large infrastructure, there's, whether it's in Atlas or other infrastructures or aggregators of information, some changes in there can make a massive big difference across the system. One of the ways that, again, this is another framing that might also assist in some of the conversations later on, is also to sort of look at the sort of flow of information data along a supply chain as such. And, from that collect space through the aggregation, people may analyse it through to the application, recognising there is a bit of a flow there, both from the data perspective through to the science that happens around some of that information, to the policy and impact space. One way of looking at these systems as well is to think, well, there are different actors and drivers at each different component along that pathway. Different costs sit at different places at that, and there are different platform systems, those types of things that operate there. But importantly, I think part of this diagram also tries to show, a lot of this data and information can sit in its individual silos, but what are those systems or things that help it flow? And social architecture is one of those considerations, and some of the work that Paul Box and others are looking at as well talk about those different components that can help that flow of data. One question to ask is, where does Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous data potentially fit or not fit within this supply chain? and how can we think of different ways of expressing, you know, that as well. I think a key component here comes into, especially in those sort of flow connecty bits there, those ready bits, excuse my technical terminology there, are the care principles that are coming out of the Indigenous data sovereignty movement. And if you listen to the session this morning and the working group that's operating out those, I think they're an important part of this discussion. One framing, I suppose, I just wanted to put in the context of what we're talking about today here is one of those mechanisms that can help that protection, as I talked about, potentially protecting Indigenous type data, is traditional knowledge labels and biocultural labels. You know, and where can they be applied or used or relevant along those different parts of that supply chain, and where there may be different application areas for that data, recognising that sometimes, particularly Indigenous cultural knowledge or traditional knowledge, may only really want to be within that, within that sort of blue and black space. They may not ever want that information going beyond those systems as well into an aggregator. Hence, that's that sort of red line that goes past the aggregators, where, you know, it may be shared beyond that local context as well. So these are just some questions that I'm sort of posing here for people to think about as Maui and others talk. To sort of look at, you know, what are the relevance of labels for Indigenous knowledge holders? What are some of the technical questions that we need to ask around the flow of information, and where do TK labels and BC labels help in that? And how do they help in some of those application areas of people who are wanting to use both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, some of that Indigenous data? So that's me for the moment. I'm happy, there are no specific questions as yet, and really mine was, my introduction was primarily just providing some framing. If people had any quick questions, let me know. Otherwise, we'll move straight into Maui giving you the sort of the meat of the session in that sense. Nope, I can't see any here. So I will unshare and I'll let you, Maui, share.
How's that?
Excellent, yep.
Okay, well, kia ora koutou, ko mā kia o te maunga, ko waiawa te awa, ko mā tātua te waka, ko whakatohia te iwi, ko Māori Hudson tuko ingoa. That is my acknowledgement to the place and the people which I connect with, which is the Whakatohia tribe here in New Zealand. Just wanted to add some thoughts in the context of the land acknowledgements that Stephanie had given earlier as well, and that connection to how that acknowledgement of place and that connection to people, how we make that translate through the data. So when we're meeting and we're doing this in a sort of a face-to-face session, we get to hear it and feel it. But as that gets recorded, or that information that's associated with those things starts to move through the systems, how do we maintain that same kind of connection and provenance? And that was really partly behind how the traditional knowledge and the biocultural labels has come about. So I'm delivering this bit of a presentation today on behalf of myself and Jane Anderson. Jane's based at NYU, which is locked down in the middle of pretty much crisis COVID central in the US, and it's also the middle of the night there. So I got the straw for this. And just as a little bit of a background, or probably just to just keep this in mind, is that when we get through, you'll see that the biocultural labels, which are relatively new development, are modelled on the traditional knowledge available, traditional knowledge labels. And they've been worked up for a much longer period of time. And you can find more information about them at the website there, localcontext.org. The conversations we've had about how they apply is that we feel like they support the implementation of the care principles. And even though the care principles have been developed more recently, there's a real natural synergy between the sorts of things which they're trying to do. And you can find more information about the care principles at gita.global.org, unless you watched the presentation from this morning. And then Enrich is an entity we've put together to really promote the implementation of digital ethics strategies like the labels that promote Indigenous rights and interests in data. So just in starting, I did want to mention the Global Indigenous Data Alliance and a little bit about the care principles, in part because a lot of this has been framed around the notion of Indigenous data sovereignty and how you promote Indigenous control of Indigenous data in all of its sort of forms and manifestations. And as the world becomes more digitally connected and as data becomes increasingly open, the sorts of ways in which that knowledge was managed, protected, shared in the past don't apply in the same sort of ways. And so we have to look for new ways to represent those aspirations for Indigenous control. One of the recent developments, as Stephanie talked about, was the development of the care principles for Indigenous data governance. You'll see here, as it was being developed, there was an assessment done of the principles that were emerging from some of the Indigenous data sovereignty networks, and an assessment of some of the mainstream kind of data approaches to data ethics as well. And what was noticed was that if you think about fear in this instance, it relates to the characteristics of the data itself. And so that you want the data, wherever it sits in whatever system, to be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. But most of the Indigenous principles were focused more on the people and the purpose for which the data was being used. And so the kinds of principles that emerge from this exercise speak to that in terms of collective benefit, the authority to control, responsibility and ethics. But the work that's been done with the Research Data Alliance, and particularly with the working group that had their session earlier this morning, was really looking at the complementarity of both of these sets of principles. And so moving towards trying to make all data fair, to be fair and care. And part of that process has been just looking at the different ways that might play out. And so here's some early thinking from the CARE Indigenous Data Sovereignty Special Interest Group that we're working on what an implementation process for the CARE principles looks like, and just thinking about there's elements of CARE that relate to the practice of data collection, whether that's around defining cultural metadata or recording the provenance of data, how we think about engaging with the principles of CARE around data curation in the context of having appropriate governance models and ensuring that the data itself is fair as well. And so there was quite a big discussion this morning about the fact that often Indigenous data that's sitting in museums and archives isn't fair, because it's really difficult for the communities to find their own information. And so how do you make fair, how do you make that data fair for Indigenous communities as well? And then this component of thinking about the implementation of CARE amongst the data communities, all of us really, and ensuring that the use is consistent with Indigenous ethics, and that there's different tools that support the notions of transparency, integrity, and provenance. And you'll see just in the bottom part of this slide, the traditional knowledge labels. And that's where we feel that these things line up. So the sort of problem of inaccurate or impoverished provenance is pervasive in a lot of connections. And as those collections start to move into digital environments, a number of those issues are being hardwired into the software, so to speak. So there's things that need to be done to allow those things to be corrected. And that often involves the coming together of the researchers, all the people that are curating the data with the communities themselves, so that those things can be improved. And that's where the traditional knowledge labels come into play. And so, as I mentioned before, these were developed by Jane Anderson, and they're really cultural. They embed cultural protocols for sharing knowledge. They're machine readable, and while the labels themselves or the icons themselves are consistent, the language that sits behind them and is representative of the community position is customizable. The set of labels, and there's 18 of them that have been developed so far through engagement with various communities, reflect the Indigenous protocols that would govern how that knowledge is managed, and it brings that into the digital management context. In most cases, it's been around cultural heritage information. And through that process, they've been also able to get into discussions about how they enhance the existing metadata. And this has been in place for around 8 years now, and is been used by over 50 communities and 40 institutions, and is the interest in their application is increasing, I think, as we're moving more and more towards more digitization of the collections, and also the shifting of those collections into open spaces. And so people might have seen recently some of the controversy that emerged around the release of a whole, or the shifting of a whole lot of photographic material into the open space at the Smithsonian Institute. So because a number of these kinds of conversations hadn't taken place, there was a bit of a public kickback about it. The labels themselves are delivered through a TK label hub, and so talk about this being the community-facing infrastructure that supports the process. Communities have their own site within the hub, which they can customize the labels and then send them or deliver them to each of the institutions they're working with. Just got a couple of examples here of some of the labels. This label here is the TK attribution, traditional knowledge attribution. And so when people go into the label hub, they can see this. It's got the text there around why you would use the label. In this instance, the label should be used when you would like anyone who uses this material to know who the correct sources, custodians, and owners are. This is especially useful if the material has been wrongly attributed, or important names of the people involved in making this material or safeguarding this material are missing. The label allows you to correct historical mistakes in terms of naming and acknowledging the legitimate authorities for this material. The label asks for future users to also apply the correct names and attribution. And so for each of the labels, there's the why use this label. You'll see there's a TK label template text. So there's some text there which people can choose to adopt or use as the basis for customization. And this material here is available in Spanish, French, and has recently been translated into Māori as well. Here's another example of the culturally sensitive label. The same thing, we all know that there's all sorts of material which should only be seen by particular people or sensitive for a variety of reasons. And while that material is often sitting in places where it is openly accessible, the label is giving potential users an indication about what protocols might have been. And it's really asking them to respect that. It's not enforcing it, because that's not possible in this sort of open environment, but it's allowing those people to better understand what the community protocols look like. So this label should be used when you like external when you would like external users to know that this material has special sensitivities around it and should be treated with great care. These sensitivities could include a whole variety of things. The labels could be used to indicate that there are cultural sensitivities around the material arising from legacies of colonization, for instance, the use of derogatory language or descriptive errors. And in a similar example, here's one that's been set up to represent seasonal knowledge. And this is really, in some ways, representing a temporal sensitivity. So some songs are not supposed to be sung at certain times of the year. And while that material is available or will be available in those digital environments, it's asking people to respect those protocols. So this is one of the examples which is used fairly frequently to talk about what the application of the traditional knowledge looks like and what it does for the community and also for the institutions. And so this is an example of Passamaquoddy tribe and a recording that was original wax recording that was made of some songs and which was then stored, or which is now stored in the Library of Congress. And so on the online catalogue, here is what the information that was provided. And the only reference to the tribe itself is in the name of Passamaquoddy. Everything else that was sitting here on the official record within the Library of Congress related to what it was, who's got the rights, and where it could be found. This is a fairly impoverished record. And after engagement between the Passamaquoddy tribe and the Library of Congress about the application of the labels, they were able to add a great deal more information, metadata, traditional knowledge about what the songs were actually about and what they relate to. And you'll see here how there's been an increase in the use of Indigenous language in the record, an increase in the context around the use of that language in that song, and also the addition of the traditional labels. And you'll see here that they chose to put on the attribution label, and you'll notice alongside it that it's been customized in the sense of they've given it a name in their language, as well as the information that sits behind it has been customized by them too. They're happy for this information to be accessed for outreach purposes, educational purposes, and their expectation is that it would be non-commercial uses only. So it couldn't be sold. So this is the outward facing component, which has been improved in terms of the Library of Congress record. But behind the scenes, there's a range of activities required to make it happen. And so you see here within the mark fields. And so the need to transform the record so that it would be able to have space for each of the labels. And you'll see that they're starred with the stars. There was also a need to transform the infrastructure of the library as well. And so the database, which is the fields where things can be put in across any of the items that sit within the Library of Congress, now any of them could have a traditional knowledge label because that field has been built into their digital infrastructure. The other element which has been included as well is how it's gone about transforming the recognition of rights. And so this is the rights advisory within the Library of Congress. And you'll see that the 3 traditional knowledge labels are included in the rights advisory. And below them, you see the rights, which was the intellectual property right that's held by the Peabody, which was in the original record, is still there, but sits alongside the traditional knowledge labels. So while they represent cultural intellectual property right, they sit there alongside the intellectual property right in the rights advisory. And so I was fortunate enough to be directed towards Jane in this work probably over 18 months ago. At the time when we were trying to think through how do we deal with issues of control around gene sequences, and how do you go about recognizing Indigenous rights and interests in digital sequence information, particularly when the practice at the moment is sequences that are generated, you can't get an intellectual property over, and also they should be put into open databases so that they can be used by other people. So in moving that information into open environments, how do you recognize the Indigenous rights or interests in it? If you are in the situation where you're sharing digital sequence information, how can you collaborate around ethical access and use in ways that are consistent with existing community protocols? And when we think about all of the conversations that have taken place around Nagoya, how do you end up in a position where you can negotiate equitable outcomes, not only from the use of the genetic resources, but from the use of the digital sequence information as well? And so the idea of shifting biocultural community protocols, which have been talked about in a number of settings, and align them with the sort of the function and the format of the traditional knowledge labels, so that we can put that kind of data in context, so we can send the community protocols, which normally sit in a nice publication, and I've been involved with developing some of those sorts of guidelines here in New Zealand, but shift them from sitting on the bookshelf and attach them to the data itself. So as the data moves, the protocols and the thinking around the protocols moves with them as well. And that those make visible the provenance and also the ethics around the collections and the research, and identifies the communities that have an association with the data, and that increases the possibilities for benefit sharing. And that makes clear some of the issues around data availability and future use, and really this whole thing about connecting the data to the people and the environments over time, because we know a lot of times the primary reason for a research project and the generation of the data may not be commercial, may not be a commercial one, but that commercial possibility might emerge later on as other people get access to the information. So here in New Zealand, we've initiated the Biocultural Labels project, and we've got a working group here, which includes Jane Anderson from NYU, also John Deck from Berkeley, and a range of other people associated with some of the institutions here in New Zealand that are often involved with generating genomic data. And in the work we've done over the past 6 months, these are the 6 labels that we've come up with. A provenance label, a consent verified label, a open to collaboration label, an open to commercialization label, a multiple community label, and a research use label. So there was I'm not going to go through, so for each of the labels, we've developed a why use this label statement, and also a template text for that. And I'm not going to go through all of them at the moment, but they are, you can see them on the Enrich website. Just talking a little bit about the rationale for them though. So the provenance one is obviously so that communities that are working with a research team around the generation of that data can say something about who they are and what their relationship is. And at the moment with the expectations in Nagoya is it's primarily tied to the traditional knowledge use of those things. And as we move into sequencing more and more things, we move away from those sort of iconic species or the things which we might have a lot of traditional knowledge around to other biota for which might have been part of the ecosystem, but not necessarily something we had a sort of a unique piece of traditional knowledge for. But the association that we have with those, with that space and those things, essentially making, asserting a right to be involved in conversations about how those move into research and commercialization fields into the future. And so the provenance label starts to do that. The consent verified label is really to give people that might be accessing the data later on a degree of confidence that consent had been, consent was sought and approved for the generation of that data. Open to collaboration, a number of communities are interested in engaging with researchers, partly for what it might produce in terms of research outcomes, but also for the opportunity to build capacity in their community. And that might be scientific literacy, might be a chance for educational programs, might be a chance to have sort of research assistants working and developing skills that will lead to jobs in the future. So the chance for the opportunity for the communities to indicate that to potential users of the data in the future might create chances for them for other research avenues. Similarly, the open to commercialization. There'll be some communities that will not be open to commercialization and will have a dash through that or will not use it. But this was really signaling to researchers in the future about which communities would be open to thinking about benefit sharing arrangements. And that's one of the reasons, you know, we can see there's a natural pathway into that place where Daniel and Margaret have been working. And this provides a sort of a link in some ways between those projects that start off with no commercialization focus in the beginning, but might turn into that later on. The multiple community label, really representing the different, the fact that most species don't confine themselves to one community's tribal boundaries. And so that if one community decides to get involved in a research project, they can acknowledge that there's other communities that might have an interest in the outcomes from that. And that might be important for collaboration or commercialization into the future. And then a label that is really a, yes, we're comfortable for this being used for research. We haven't got any expectations around collaboration. So the one example I'm just going to provide here in terms of the provenance label, why use this label. Indigenous peoples have the right to make decisions around the future use of information, biological collections, data and digital sequence information that derives from associated lands, waters and territories. This label supports the practice of proper and appropriate acknowledgement into the future. And the template text which we've put together for that is, this label is being used to affirm an inherent interest Indigenous people have in scientific collections and data about communities, people and the biodiversity within their traditional lands, waters and territories. The community retains the right to be named and associated with it into the future. This association reflects a significant relation ownership and responsibility to the species or the entity and associated scientific collections and data. So at the moment here in New Zealand, we have two pilot projects that we're moving forward, moving the conversations forward with the community, people from the community themselves. Tohiro is a large mollusk, sort of big clam, and working with researchers at the University of Waikato, and the tribe is Te Roroa. But while we're working with them around its application in this space, they're already thinking about it having usefulness in other research relationships they're involved with. And similarly with my own tribe, the Whakatohia tribe, and some work we're doing around mussels, we can see that having application for a range of other interests which we have around projects into the future. And you'll see there are a few other projects where we've initiated discussions with, and they may form part of pilot projects into the future. One of the next stages will be to develop a BC label hub. In the same way, there is a TK label hub, which would be the place where those labels can be customized by communities and then delivered out to institutions in different ways or in different formats. We've also started discussions with some of the publishers, particularly a couple of the publications in the Nature Publishing Group, about the potential to have the labels represented on the landing pages for articles or on the articles themselves, so that it has a way of further promoting the ethical practice of researchers and the sort of work which they do with communities. And we're just giving a little bit of thought to the ways in which the labels could be constructed to support access and benefit sharing arrangements under the Nagoya Protocol. So expectations around prior informed consent might be represented by the consent verified label. Some of the mutually agreed terms could be reflected in the research use, open to collaboration and open to commercialization labels. And the benefit sharing would be supported in part by the provenance and the multiple community labels. And really thinking about how these labels provide a bridge between research activities and commercialization activities. It's nothing like a good diagram, and this was one that was put together by one of the researchers, Libby Liggins, who's on our Biocultural Labels Working Group, and that was her just starting to think about really a data life cycle from collection to the research, to the sequencing, to the outputs and the reuse, and the places where you might start thinking about the application of labels or notices and how they would then track through these different places. And in some ways, this is a little bit of a segue into the conversation about notices, because you'll see here the conversation which we've had so far about the labels has been about how they're developed and applied by the communities. And the notices are another tool that acts in a very similar way to the labels, but it's something that can be applied by the researchers. And so the traditional knowledge notices and the biocultural notices are distinct interventions in the sense that they're not customizable, so they just sit there in that format, and they're in essence a placeholder on a data or sample field or in the metadata until a community gets around to being able to put in place a traditional knowledge or a BC label. So we know that there's a range of priorities which communities have, and sometimes the application of labels won't be high on the list of things, particularly at times like the moment. But if a notice is applied and the infrastructure within the institution is transformed to allow space for it to sit, then it can be a placeholder for the labels being put in place at a later time. But what it does do is it allows the researchers to recognize that there are some interests around either traditional knowledge or biocultural interests in the data that is being published or put out in open environments. And so this traditional knowledge, why use this notice? To recognize the right of Indigenous peoples to permission the use of information collections data. That is the BC notice. Data and digital sequence information generated from their biodiversity. So, sorry, this is the one which I thought I'd changed and I hadn't. So this is actually the text for the BC notice. You get the instance where this is recognizing that there's some rights that sit there, and even though I can't say what they are, as a researcher, I can just recognize that they're there and make it really clear that that's what I'm doing. And while this is the BC notice, it's still the same text. And just this final slide here is really saying that we're trying to think about how these things work as part of an ecosystem. So you saw the slide from Stephanie talking before about the Atlas of Living Australia, where we're starting to get these places which aggregate not only the science information, but increasingly traditional knowledge, and wanting to bring that into play to show the value which all of these data sets have. So within a format like that, you might apply traditional knowledge labels to the traditional knowledge components of it. And then there might be biocultural labels that sit alongside the scientific data generated off the Indigenous species. And so those things can sit there alongside the notices, which the researchers get to use to demonstrate their kind of recognition of those Indigenous rights and interests. And also in the bottom right-hand corner, something which I haven't spoken about, but is just really the cultural institution notice. So these are the sorts of things that the Library of Congress has in place, which now they've been through the process with the Passamaquoddy tribe, have said, look, we recognize that there's a lot of places where attribution is incomplete, and we are open to collaboration. And that's what those two notices represent there. And that's just from an institutional point of view, they can be indicating their openness to being involved in these sorts of generative discussions. So just want to say thank you very much. And I will unshare my screen.
Thanks very much, Mally. We might just have a few questions now, just a few, and we can have bigger questions later on. I was just looking through the chat function, and one of the ones from, I think it was Aaron, or was talking about, do you agree that BC labels more widely acceptable than just sequence data, but any data about genetic resources, especially given reference to DSI, which has a broader definition via Nagoya and CBD?
Yeah, sure. I think we've been, I've partly been focusing on the genomic data because that's some of the people I've been working with. And there's, at least in the New Zealand context, we often talk about the whakapapa, or the sort of genealogical relationships between people and the environment, or species in the environment. And so people resonate and can connect with that sort of genetic relatedness in a stronger way than they do with some of the other forms of information. But I think, you know, as you're indicating, I think it can be used in a much more broader way. And once people start thinking about it around the genomic part, they think about how it might be applied to other forms of, or other types of scientific data being generated, which they just want to be involved in conversations about what use looks like into the future.
Excellent. Whether anybody had any specific questions now, raise your hand, or we'll have a broader conversation later on. Can't see any hand raising. Chat function. Excellent. Well, I just might now move on to John Locke. So he's a business owner, Biocultural Consulting, but he's also, you know, closely embedded with the rainforest people in northern Queensland. And I'll let you, John, introduce yourself a little bit more and give some of your perspectives around these concepts. Thanks, John. Just have to unmute there. Oh, no, you're still on mute. Oh, I can unmute you. Or can I?
Oh, there you go.
There you are. You're good.
Thanks, mate. Yeah, look, I think I'll follow on with what some of the stuff that Maui was talking about, but which is of real interest. But I think from mine, as you said, my interest stems from, and I'll talk about from both the personal sort of strategic level, is my culture's from patrilineal and matrilineal lines of the rainforests, the wet tropics rainforests in Cairns. It's my grandfather's country. My grandmother's country's in Cape York. And professionally, basically, is having held a management position with the Environmental Protection Agency in Queensland, head office, and now with, as you've said, with the Traditional Leadership Group, which is a think tank for over 120 clan groups in the wet tropics rainforests. And some of the work that we're doing in that space, as well as just being re-offered and accepted to the Scientific Advisory Committee for the World Heritage Wet Tropics, advising the board. But look, the real interest for me is some of the direction, and certainly from a personal perspective, and I hope I'm going to be able to get up just a map so you can sort of see what I'm talking about. Yeah, share. Well, no, did I have to add that into the files, did I? No. Oh, no, it's not going to work. Okay, that's fine. So basically what's been happening is, and it's really interesting what Maui was talking in terms of genetic data and relatedness. So there's a real push in terms of spatially mapping customary landscape scales, and that in itself brings that part about metadata and what's held in shapefiles, because it's something that hasn't been done, and yet Australia and New Zealand through ANZLIC relies on spatial data, and some of those key things that spatial data does, for example, is about territorial cohesion and also about access to knowledge and information. So what we see in the move forward for us as groups is how we define those landscape scales at which we operate, and whether they be, you know, right down to our group, for example, my exact clan family in the Cape. We've actually mapped out our exact clan family landscape, and we're looking at them in terms of trusted systems. So as part of this whole approach in terms of the labels and whether it's TK or BC, is how we would use those and connect them at different landscape scales. And they would jump down through from you know, if I took it at the broadest level around language group, which we belong to Cook-speaking people in that part of the Cape, or you jump down to tribal level, which is Cook-Yalanji, or you jump down to clan level, which is Cookamini for us, and then you jump down to clan family. But then you go further down through the scales, and you're looking at that landscape scale. And one of the key things that we've been following, which is of interest to us, is, and it's interest to me from a strategic point of view, and some of the projects I'm involved in, is that part about landscape approaches, and you're looking at those variations around what's the condition of a landscape, what's its function, what's its spatial structure, and what's its history. And you put that mirror up for Western landscape approaches, and then you marry that with the customary side. So we're asking questions primarily about what's the customary function of a landscape. And to give you an idea, and if I would have been able to throw up one of the maps that I started talking with the elders about, is one of the primary starting points is actually looking at bloodline, and those bloodline comes from the river systems, the hydrology. So part of this is about the way that we would look at rainbow serpent hydrology and then follow those in terms of the landscape scales that they knit out in terms of the spatial planning that's gone on for those cultural structures that I mentioned before. But in that is all that part about genetic resources that have connectivity to group at those larger scales right down to the individual. So some of these labels, for example, and if you go back and look at the ones that, the biocultural ones that were mentioned, I know right now there's the research protocols that are being developed in the north, how we would attach that so that we know that those researchers are doing and connecting with Indigenous peoples, and there's been a good slice of work done on that. But more importantly, I think from a local level approach is that whole relatedness that can be connected from a landscape or even a resource, or maybe one of the examples would be some of the work that's just being put on my plate for consideration is around classification streams for an element within the biophysical space. But they're wanting to look at the biocultural values that connect. And so the connectivity, not only just between people, but between the natural and the cultural systems. So the example would be freshwater swamps, Lucas Stream, but then you look at swamp grass that's used for basket weaving or whatever it may be. But species like that have a natural function in terms of water quality. So there's this whole sort of connectivity between what culturally is being done, but then on the scientific side, what's being done. But also, we understand the natural processes as well, and they're really connected into what we do as groups. So I was thinking, as I was listening to what Maui was talking about and those labels, and certainly coming back to, and I think one of my colleagues is on the line as well, that was part of the Traditional Knowledge Roundtable group, which is part of the Biodiscovery, review of the Biodiscovery Act of Queensland. And some of those conversations that have gone on in that space, because mapping has come up in that perspective, and that's about endemic genetic resources that sit individually within particular landscape scales. But so we know exactly where those resources sit, and there's that part that we've been talking about what we call right people for right country, and what that captures is who are the speakers for that country. Who are the knowledge holders for that country, but then who are the user-fructory rights-based people, and that's just about those who exercise the activities with those species. So you get this real deep depth of actually the connectivity, the relatedness, and then how we actually use that in terms of what we're talking today and doing connecting those sorts of points. But I think there's, if I ramped it up to the highest level, it's about, on one level, having the legislative policy, strategy type methods, tools type levels for Australia that allows us to get out and do this type of work. And some of that does rest with ANZLIC, and because one of their key aims is about the social, economic, and environmental fabric of a nation. The cultural stuff is left out of that. So if we can pick that up, and if I step back a minute, and if I think about one of the key reasons about looking at my clan family space is that we are one of 3 clan families who come from 2 different skin groups who own a massive pastoral lease in Cape York, 148,000 hectares. But part of this process that I see that fits exactly the way that we're thinking is about trusted systems. So if I jump again back to ANZLIC, so under ANZLIC is your Foundation Spatial Data Framework, and those themes in there are about trusted systems. Your land and parcel property that you have, your house sits on, is a trusted system. Who owns it? What's its value in a district? What's its boundaries? And so what we're doing is taking the pastoralists as a current trusted system, and then inside there, mapping out the different cultural family landscape scales, and we'll register them under the Cultural Heritage Act. So all the time what we're starting to do is to keep on moving forward with relevant pieces of spatial information, if you like, but the metadata in that carries that connectivity and the relatedness. And then tools like this, we start to bring further into things that we're doing and connecting the dots through there. Especially, and I think, one of the other things about the Universal Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples, well, one of those, which is Article 31, actually deals with human genetic resources. So where that becomes important to me in terms of genetic resources is actually the human genetic resources. So at the moment, what I'm doing, and both myself and a friend, is we're actually tracking using rainbow serpent hydrology that I mentioned before, and the way that traditional marriages are set up. And if you think about some of the work that's been done on how we've kept those bloodlines clean because we're such an isolated space or an isolated nation, this has become part, and a really critical part, of keeping those bloodlines quite clear, so that different genetic diseases or whatever may not appear within those spaces. So it's really interesting the way that our people have used those systems to know who should marry who. But all that connectivity has great connections to up and downstream in terms of or regional ecosystems in terms of species and habitats that rest within them. So, for example, my grandfather in the high country in the Cape is white cockatoo. So he had to make sure that the wife, which is the great-grandmother, was from a specific clan group and bloodline in terms of the proper marriage processes. So these things are quite connected, and it's going to be quite interesting the way that, and as Maui points to, the way that we will use these coming up into the future, the way that we look at ourselves from that human space and the relatedness between the natural, cultural, but the human and the natural, and then try and work through those things and work with them. But yeah, look, I find it to be a really interesting space, really interesting conversation. And I saw somewhere before someone said about how we might set up an Australian sort of group to look at this. That would be really interesting to see how we try and move that forward. Thanks, Deb.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, John. Did anybody have any specific questions for John while we're here? I had a few questions that were sort of more answering some of the questions, asking Maui to answer some of the questions that John was asking around scale, trusted systems and things like that. So, excellent. Well, we might just, I think there's some great points in there, John, as well. I really like that scale part as well, from the individual to the landscape, to the group to the landscape. I think it's going to be really interesting how you might apply some of the labels in that scale as well.
Well,
I might just, sorry.
I've just one point that you've just reminded me of is that part in there about governance. So what people struggle with our groups is the way that governance is applied. So in the high country, which in the Cape, our old people or our people sort of tend to look at those landscapes, the high country, as islands because they jut up off the landscape. But in the lowlands, so there's two different governance systems. In the high country, you follow your father's line. So I come from a woman's line. I don't have responsibilities. I have rights in that country. I don't have responsibilities country. So there's a different decision-making governance process. Down in the lowlands, it can be quite different. It can be both mothers and mothers' fathers' lines. So there's been a lot of And I think some of this stuff actually will have an effect on the way that even you set up what's happened through native title and some of those structures, because they're supposed to operate through traditional oral customers. Can be quite interesting just how some of this stuff may affect even that level of interaction. So, yeah.
Thanks very much, John. Just move now on to Dan Robinson and Margaret Raven, and I'll let them, they're going to be talking about some of those parts of that supply chain at that, you know, the protocol side of life, as well as some of the sort of application around protection and the work that they've been doing a lot on, so for instance, patent landscaping in this area. So I'll hand over to you, Margaret and Dan. I can't hear either of you yet. I think you're still there, hopefully. Oh, there's Margaret. You're still on mute. Oh, you're on mute. Let me see if I can unmute you. Sorry, Margaret. Oh, shouldn't. I thought I hadn't unmute.
Thanks. Dan was going to start.
Sorry about that.
That's okay. Dan was going to start first, so I'll let you go, Dan.
Yeah, it's working now. Thanks so much, Stephanie, and thanks, Maui and John, for those really good and interesting presentations as well. Yeah, my name's Daniel Robinson. I'm a professor at the University of New South Wales, and I'm mostly going to be talking about an ARC discovery project that I do with Margaret, who you can also see there. The project is called Indigenous Knowledge Futures, and it's about protecting and promoting Indigenous knowledge. And Margaret is a Scientia Fellow at UNSW, and she's a co-CI on this project with me. And I'll let Margaret introduce herself in more detail in a little while. So I just wanted to talk about mostly about that project. I'll also just mention I'm also the Pacific Regional Manager for the Access and Benefit Sharing Capacity Development Initiative, which is a very long title. So we call it the ABS Initiative. And that's mostly implementing the Nagoya Protocol in the Pacific region. And so it has some relevance to this discussion. But I'll mostly focus on this ARC grant. So the discovery project that we're doing, Indigenous Knowledge Futures, is, I mean, the Nagoya Protocol is essentially the impetus for that project, and obviously also influenced by the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And our thinking on the project is to look at a number of different mechanisms through research that we can support communities, Indigenous communities, to protect and promote their Indigenous knowledge. You know, so we have a number of different tools that I'll go through in the project that we're using. Just to give you a bit of background on, I think everyone here sounds like they know a lot about the Nagoya Protocol, so I probably don't need to talk about that. But one of the interesting things in the Nagoya Protocol is that it's broadened from the Convention on Biodiversity definitions to include traditional knowledge. And it also talks about recognizing customary law and community protocols. So we took that as an important opportunity to look at customary law, to look at Indigenous laws, and also to start developing community protocols or other kinds of protocols like research protocols, and even sort of supporting contracts and agreements, so ABS, mutually agreed terms type agreements between communities and enterprises and researchers that might be looking at developing something based on a biological resource or the associated traditional knowledge as well. So the scale of our project is, it's in Australia, and we focus mostly on Northern Australia, and also in the Pacific. So we work in Vanuatu quite extensively throughout the country, and in Cook Islands. And we picked these countries, obviously Australia, because this is where we are and where we're from, but also Vanuatu and Cook Islands have had some interesting regulatory developments. So they've got traditional knowledge laws and ABS permit systems and that sort of thing. And also, we've focused on these places because they have interesting bush foods and medicines value chains that are occurring in those countries as well. Now, there's three main parts to our project. The first part is using pattern landscaping to identify the scale and use of biological resources and associated traditional knowledge in the pattern system. So we use searches of the main pattern databases with Aboriginal and Pacific bush foods and medicines species names as keywords. So the way we do this is we look up ethnobotanic texts, so texts that have been written by explorers, botanists, historians in the past, and current, more contemporary texts on bush foods and medicines as well. And we use those as to identify some of the main species that have been used in the countries, to see which researchers are investigating these and filing patents, because I mean a big reason for the Nagoya Protocol is biopiracy. So we're interested in who is filing patents on these species, and we create sort of profiles of the species and also the countries, and we've got all these statistics that we can produce. As an aside project, we've also done this with Maori knowledge in New Zealand to sort of document a few hundred species in New Zealand. So we use those pattern databases as the pattern landscape results as a tool for then doing further analysis. And some of that's historical, and it's also with communities. So that's part two of our project. We basically do case studies on particular species where we found interesting results from the pattern analysis. So Kakadu plum is one that we're well known for. We've been involved in even challenges. So I challenged with a bunch of collaborators the patent filing on Kakadu plum several years ago by Mary Kay Company, and that was a pre-grant opposition, which was successful in Australia, and from that we hope we've opened the market for growing Indigenous enterprises in Australia. And then there's a recent one we filed on Gumby Gumby, which is a Pittosporum species, Pittosporum angustifolium. And we've sort of picked out a few species where we're concerned about the patent, its impact, and also where there is sort of growing Indigenous bush food and medicine interest and activity, where there's industry starting up. But also where there's cultural and spiritual significance of the species. So Gumby Gumby is a good example, and this goes back to some of the stuff both John and Maui have mentioned. There are genealogical relationships with Gumby Gumby. In central Queensland, Gumby Gumby is seen as a totemic species for the Urundali people, for example. And I think it's significant for many, First Nations people in Australia as well, that species. And it's a widespread species, so it's found in many parts of Australia, but there are specific monopoly filings that have happened in Australia and trademarks, etc. So we're doing case studies like that, where we sort of get involved and we analyse in greater depth the history and the cultural significance of the species. And part three of our project is a large component of the project, really, and takes up a lot of our time, is the development of community protocols. And often this is based on customary law of the communities. And we've largely focused on the biotrade side of things, where there's a need, where there's bush foods and medicines activity. So we've been talking to enterprises, Aboriginal enterprises, and Indigenous enterprises or local communities in Vanuatu, and where communities are actively trading in the different species. Because that's where there has been concern about some of the people they're selling it to, for example, filing for patents in some cases. So this component, we've done quite a lot of this work in Vanuatu. We have draft protocols now in Vanuatu, and we have one in Cook Islands. And in Australia, a lot of the work has actually been more about sort of research protocols, and has been about helping support access and benefit sharing contracts. So there's been slightly different needs in Australia, and you know, there's a few reasons for that, and some of them are colonial and to do with native title and permissions and things like that. But I don't want to go on too long. I just wanted to say, before I hand over to Margaret, that you know, it's interesting, the discussion about digital sequence information as well. And while our project is focused a lot on the communities doing the bio trading and developing community protocols with those communities, it is really interesting and important to also be thinking about the fact that researchers are increasingly sequencing these species and using them in technology, rather than going to the source and buying them. In cosmetics industries and food industries, sure, they're likely to keep buying the raw materials, but in other industries like pharmaceuticals and biotech, it's much more likely that they'll be able to use digital sequencing and use synthetic biology to sometimes genetically produce or biochemically produce some of the materials they need to make their drugs, for example. So we think the community protocols that we're doing align well with the TK labels and the BC labels, and I think this is a really important sort of step forward, and you know, we're really excited to hear about what Maui and Jane and others are doing in this space. So I think that's enough from me. I'll hand over to Margaret to talk a bit more about the community protocols and some of the work we've been doing and that Margaret's been doing in the past.
Great, thanks, Dan. Hello to everyone on this weird sphere. So I'm Margaret Raven. I'm a Scientia Fellow at UNSW. Sorry, terribly sorry. My sister's in quarantine and she's trying to call me right in the middle of it. I'm originally from Western Australia. I'm Yamatji and Noongar, and on my mother's side, and also White or Pakeha from New Zealand. So as Dan said, I've been working on this project with him on the Australian Research Council Indigenous Knowledge Futures project. But prior to that, I actually did some research looking at what protocols are. And some of this thinking comes from conversations that I had with Jane Anderson a very long time ago when she was still living in Australia. I guess what I wanted to say is that, you know, we have this term protocol that gets bandied around a lot, and often it's not defined, or if it's defined in a particular way. So, I mean, I consider protocols to be something that's used to control practices or behaviours or the flow of information and knowledge, but it's used in a variety of contexts. So as well as in the Indigenous context, it's also used in computer networks, so computer network protocols. It's used in Indigenous research. The military uses them, laboratories use them. They're used to help stem epidemics and pandemics. So there was an Ebola protocol when there was the outbreak of Ebola. And there are now protocols that are continually coming out around COVID-19. So in the context of Indigenous research, they're often positioned as rules or rules of engagement, as standards, a guide to good practice, appropriate ways of behaving and communicating and working with others. They're prescriptive tools, they're rights-based approaches to affirm self-determination, agents of change, and a form of or a source of private law. So they're used in lots of different ways, and I think there's some good elements to that, and there's also some bad bits to it. So often there's a slippage around the use of the term protocol, and I think we can often get ourselves in a bind that we can talk past each other and we're not sure what we mean when we say protocols. So in the context of computer networks, there's a guy, and I rely heavily on him, there's a guy called Galloway, and this is his book. So anyone who's into social theory or post-structural theory or into computer networks, this would be quite a useful book. In his book, he basically argues that, well, he uses this kind of protocol as a road rule metaphor, which I find quite useful. And he argues that in a computer network, there's the highway and the protocol. And the protocol, the road rules, that direct the set of possible behavior patterns within the system. So he gives a couple of examples of what a protocol is and what it isn't. So he gives the example of a car that drives from one place to another and has to stop at a give way sign or a stop sign before it's able to go on its journey. And he says that, you know, this could be considered a protocol, but actually like something that's protological or something that actually changes behavior is something more like a speed bump. So a car doesn't always have to stop at a stop sign. Some people can drive through a stop sign, but a speed hump will force the car to slow down regardless of what the driver is doing, or it will break the car. So it will decrease the speed at which the car can move. So he's saying that in a computer network, a protocol is something that actually changes behavior. So everything we do in our lives, from sending a text message to emails to opening up a web page, all of that is controlled by protocols. And there's lots of different types of protocols. So there's communication protocols, there's protocols that create the information into little chunks and move it on to different places. And there's protocols that get that chunk of information and say, yes, this is bona fide, we can accept the information. And then there's another protocol that will put it back together. So Galloway also argues, sorry, this is technical. I'm saying this so that we can link up the indigenous protocols and the computer protocols for the data sovereignty. He also says that protocols like a new apparatus of control. Protocols how technological control exists after centralization. It's a set of recommendations and rules that outline specific technical standards. It's also contingent and exists in a contingent environment. So what he's saying that you can write a protocol, but it really depends upon the context in which it's being placed. So if you get a protocol from an Indigenous community and you write it for that particular context, but then you take it somewhere else into a research context, in a social science research context, or in another type of context, it's not necessarily going to behave in the same way or have the same function. The other bit that I think is quite useful for the discussion around the use of protocols for protecting Indigenous knowledge is that it's this real paradox between stability and flexibility. So what the protocol wants to do is write a hard set of rules that people need to follow. But given the nature of what we're trying to do and what, you know, sharing of information and wanting to create new products, there has to be some flexibility around it. And that's essentially what a protocol does in a computer environment and in other contexts, is it creates a set of rules which have to be followed, but there is a little bit of flexibility, a bit of give and take in those particular rules or codes or whatever you want to call it. By code, I don't mean guidelines, I mean computer code. I wanted to also talk about laboratory settings. So there's also in the laboratory setting, so there's not as much literature written on protocols around this, but there is a guy called Lynch, who incidentally doesn't really like my work so much, but I love his work. He says that a laboratory protocol is like a recipe, and I find this quite useful because what he's saying is that that so it's, hang on, I'll just read what I've got written here. So sought to elaborate on the nature of laboratory protocols as a thing that includes a list of ingredients with a step-by-step instruction. So he's saying in a laboratory setting, when you go in to do a chemical, to do something, I'm not a chemist, but when you go into a lab to do something, to do a particular experiment, you usually have a set of the things that you need and how you should go about it. So he uses this recipe idea to say that you don't just go and bake a cake. You know, in order to bake a cake, you need to know all of the things you need. So it's like the food parts, but it's also like, you know, what other things do you need in order to bake that cake? You also need to make sure you have your mixing bowl and the oven. Once you've got all of those things, you need to know what to do with it. And so he's saying that's kind of what a protocol does in a laboratory setting. And I think if we take elements of what Galloway says and also what Lynch says around protocols, we can begin to get a better handle on the type of protocols that we need to build to be embedded in traditional knowledge that can deal with the digital environment. So the way that protocols are talked about and the way that we're using them in the project with Dan is less about this computer network and this laboratory setting, and is more the kind of way that's traditionally been considered, which is, you know, community rules and community standards for which people need to abide by. And so I just wanted to set that up as a possibility to consider, you know, as we begin to talk about or as we are talking about the digital context, that, you know, when we talk about protocols, it can just be those standards, or it can just be, sorry, I just saw a comment. It can be the standards, it can be the rules and the recipes. We don't just have to think about the kind of the principles. We can actually embed all of this into code that can exist within the system. It doesn't have to be that someone can find something and then go, oh, what are the standards for using this? That we can actually build it into those BC labels, or in another way in which people, so less building a stop sign and more building a speed bump, where people don't have a choice. They have to use it in a particular way. But you can have, you know, in order to get that stop sign, you need to know, in order to get that speed bump, you need to know, you know, what is it that the owners of that traditional knowledge want done with it. And so that's the step that we've been doing. Dan and I have been doing on the ARC project. You know, and that's more about linking kind of customary and state law, or linking customary law with other ways of managing knowledge. In terms of biocultural community protocol, it's like a statement of values or intent or an action from Indigenous peoples and local communities. In some ways, depending upon how it's recognised, it can enable a legal recognition if it's attached to a contract or in law. So in Vanuatu and the Cook Islands, there's an attempt to recognise these protocols in the legislation. So up until fairly recently, protocols have been put forward as this kind of magic bullet almost, but there's been difficult trying to figure out, you know, how do you actually implement something? And I think putting it in legislation is one way to ensure that people can actually respect it. They've been used all around the world, so there's some in Africa and Asia. And the usual process for development is to, you know, talk about data collection, to have workshops and forums, to have a community comment, to publish, and then to adopt them. So in Vanuatu, what we've done is we've gone to the communities quite a number of times to talk about the research, first to see if they want to, you know, write down their protocols, which I guess is codifying it in some ways, and what they want to do with that and how they want to get it out. So at the moment, what they're looking like are community notice boards that will be at the point where people come into communities. So most of these communities are like remote communities in Australia. There's very few ways to get in. So, you know, there's 1 or 2 jetties into that community. So if a yacht pulls up in the bay, everyone knows it's there. or if someone drives in on a truck, there's only one road in and out. So there's an actual spot that you can put that notice. So we're just in the process of putting together those protocols to go back and talk to the communities about, is this what you want? Is this the format you want? And what else can we do to support the recognition of your protocols? So thank you. That's it.
Thanks very much, Margaret and Dan. Really appreciated that. And it's fantastic context of really understanding some of our, language, how we conceptualize things, but actually seeing how it can be applied in a particular area. Did anybody, and I think I've changed the mute things now, so anybody can ask questions. Maybe nobody asked questions before because I had this mute thing on. Did anybody have any questions for Dan and Margaret? I had one there. You talked about legal motivation as potentially being a sort of a key speed bump, that people are driven by compliance or it's a legal obligation. But, and this is sort of partly a question also to Maui, I'm assuming too that the TKBC labels aren't necessarily legally enforceable. So, do we need to recognise some other motivations to make these things operational?
Who wants to answer?
Sorry, go. So what I didn't touch on is motivation. So look, it depends on what you're using to guide your motivation, but there's, there is a whole body of literature on economic behaviour and motivation, that there's a lot of self-interested people out there, so they will only do what is in their self-interest. But there is also a massive body of literature around stewardship, which I call Guardian. So some people may not necessarily need to have some kind of legal motivation. They may already be guided by some kind of stewardship. What you essentially need to do is to make sure that those that are guided by stewardship can be guided in the right direction. But those that are self-interested, they're the ones that you need to spend a lot more of your energy on. And that's where the, that's where the less a stop sign and more a speed bump comes in, is you have to force those people that don't want to slow down or stop for a stop sign to actually stop. And it has to be something that, I don't know, I think it has to be something that doesn't enable them to take the information in any way without getting the, whatever it is, a pin to get into the, I don't know what it would be. It would be something like that.
I think, just quickly, even in the legal context in Vanuatu and Cook Islands, the way they're going is, I think the community protocols, they'd be hard to enforce legally anyway, but they're a way of getting researchers to try and comply from the outset. So when they come into a community to collect noni or one of the other plants that are used as a traditional medicine, at least the researchers are on the front foot. And in a way, because of an additional system in those countries so Vanuatu, you need a permit to enter, or actually both countries, you need a permit to enter the country to do any research. You could get in trouble under that research permission process, or lose money, or even be fined. You could be fined or jailed or whatever if you didn't comply. So at the moment, the community protocols are more like a signpost, like a guide to researchers to behave appropriately. But depending upon how strict they want to be, there is sort of a mechanism under their Nagoya compliant legislation to punish people, particularly in Vanuatu. I know there is, yeah.
Yeah, so just in terms of the labels are being set up not as an extra legal tool, and I think they probably fit between these two places. So the conversations that get had about development of community protocols, if they are codified to a sense within the labels, and that allows the labels to travel probably a little bit further than you would be able to send the community protocols, whether it's outside the village or kind of on a book or a guideline somewhere, and allow it to travel as a part of that global system. it's unenforceable until the point where it becomes enforceable, like Daniel said, through other sorts of legislation or kind of international conventions. And I think what we're seeing is some of those that legislation being put into place sort of subsequent to the requirements around Nagoya. So it's not there yet in most places, but it's starting to move towards that.
Were there any other questions that people had? I realise we're sort of getting a little bit over time, I must admit. I think we're 10 minutes over, so but interesting conversation. So now, if I ever hold your peace. I think I've unmuted everybody, so if nobody was. So what I really wanted to, here's a question from Hannah actually. Would there be value in a university accreditation framework, which is backed with these labels as a starting point, and inclusion perhaps in sort of reconciliation action plans? Funny you should say I could answer sort of a question. I mean, I suppose that is an important part from an institutional perspective. You know, CSIRO, as an example, we're developing sensitive data policies, we're developing all sorts of data policies where you can potentially embed, you know, key statements around protection and provide tools to do that. I think it's definitely a key way.
Mm. Yeah, there's the conversations we've had around the sort of application of the labels here in New Zealand have you would have seen has largely been on sort of a project by project basis. But some of the institutions that are we're working with in that context are thinking about it more as a institutional responsibility that would apply to all of their work. And they're just at the early stages of thinking through what that might look like. It's not a sort of an active kind of an active conversation at the moment. It's certainly sitting there in the background. And we've also initiated some conversations at a national level in terms of how people might respond to Y262, which is a sort of a treaty right around intellectual property and native flora and fauna, and also how that then sort of connects in with the Nagoya. So whether you could start to create a more system-based component, which the labels, you know, could be one part of.
Well, I better. Oh, sorry.
I was just going to say, we've done a bit of, I guess, just presentations more about ABS basically to the universities, to some universities and institutions like CSIRO. So different groups in CSIRO have asked us to do some of these talks. But where we're getting requests for labels, it's quite interesting, is in biotrade. So even the Union for Ethical Biotrade, and I'm curious if Maui has spoken to UEBT, Union for Ethical Biotrade, which does sort of fair and equitable biotrade and sustainable biotrade, but they also have an ABS framework for their members, and they're a membership-based organisation. They are interested in some sort of labelling process as well. That might be used, that they could use with their biotrading companies, so that some sort of ABS accreditation or some sort of sign that they can put on contracts or on products that are being traded. So I'm just wondering if they've approached you, Maui, or
no, nothing, no, not yet.
Okay.
Brilliant. Well, I might finish off there, and finally I just wanted to thank our sort of wonderful speakers for providing such a sort of broad ranging you know, conversation around the TK labels and Indigenous data sovereignty and protocols and different processes. And you as participants for hanging in there a bit longer. I think a few people dropped out, but in that end, I think it's being recorded, and I think we'll hopefully make some of the presentations available but really interested in everybody continuing this conversation. So there is a Google Doc where if you want to add, yes, want to hear more and any ideas about how we might continue the conversation. There's also within RDA and GIDA, there's a working group in both the care principles as well. So go and look those things up as well, and I'll provide links to those as well on that Google Doc. And I think that's probably, and also to RDA for continuing this, and hopefully we can do some more. So thank you again, everyone, and stay safe, stay healthy, and have a good rest over the Easter holidays, and hopefully we can talk again in the near future.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ciao.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Stephanie, can you save my chat for me?
I have.
Oh, good, thank you. I might stop the recording.